We've talked about this before, you know, different ways of knowing. If you're going to whisk away the carpet, don't you have to put something else in its place first? Some sort of.
Well, I don't know about what the carpet is that's being whisked away. I mean, I think there is, of course, a tendency for people to imagine that religion provides something like meaningfulness in life. But often, you know, when you talk to people who have a religious belief, it isn't really very much different from the kind of belief that I have. It's just a sort of general sense of kind of hopefulness, a sense that, you know, things might be better for the offspring than they are for the parents, a general sense that somehow the problems that we as a group confront, that they can be solved. And those are things that I share as well. But of course, it's another very different issue to try to have a sort of institution of ignorance, which really tries to prevent science from moving forward and tries to prevent science from making discoveries that can help. And there, I think, you know, I mean, the fact of it is that there are people, and Leon Cass on the President's Bioethics Council is one of them, who opposes the very idea of the Enlightenment, thinks that the period of the Enlightenment was one of the great tragedies of human history, and that we really would have been better off living in what you and I would call the Dark Ages, but in what he would think of as an age where people had the comfort of knowing that they would go to hell if they didn't do what the priest said, and so on and so forth. And I don't know how you talk somebody out of that,
well,
really.
You probably must have tried, because you actually went and gave evidence to the President's Council on Bioethics. It wasn't Mr. Smith goes to Washington, it was Mr. Smith's daughter goes to Washington, right?
That's right.
So what did you tell him?
Yes, so I was invited to address the President's Bioethics Council in Washington, and it's a rather impressive and august group of people. Most of them are physicians of one kind or another. There were a number of issues that they had wanted to talk about, but human dignity was the preeminent issue. And my understanding was that the issue of human dignity was up for discussion mainly because of its role in stem cell research, and that was because of the use of human embryos. Mm-hmm. And there was also, I think, some expectation that it was an issue for assisted suicide. So I pondered long and hard about how best to address them. I mean, I was first of all quite shocked to be invited, because it is very much, of course, of the color and stripe of the current administration. But my thought was, look, human dignity really does have something to do with acquiring power over the tragedies of life through knowledge. So I have long been interested in the history of religious resistance to biomedical technologies. And so I wanted to talk to them about a number of incidents in the history of the resistance. And the first one had to do with the Church's opposition to dissection of bodies. And this occurred in the very early part of the Renaissance. It's not clear why there was this resistance, but it had something to do with the expectation that there would be a physical resurrection, and if you had dissected a body, that it might be difficult for the all-powerful God to put it together again. And of course, that was a great mistake, because being able to dissect bodies was extremely important in understanding how they work. You have to know the structure and the anatomy if you're going to understand. So that was one thing. And, of course, that was quietly dropped, the opposition. Nobody really stood up from the pulpit and said, sorry, guys, we were wrong. It's okay to dissect. It's just that it quietly was dropped. The second really major issue had to do with smallpox vaccination. When Jenner discovered that you could proof someone against the disease of smallpox, it was extremely important. Thousands of children every year died a most horrible and miserable death. Many others contracted smallpox and didn't die, but were left terribly disfigured. The church, both the Catholic and the Protestant church, opposed smallpox vaccination and preached against it on grounds that it was God's will that someone would acquire or be immune to smallpox. Now, the interesting thing was that the church, again, ultimately changed its position, but not because they sort of stood up and said, my God, this was a terrible mistake, we were wrong, but because people essentially voted with their feet. They said, we want this. The benefits were so clear, so overwhelming, so obvious, that the opposition by the church essentially withered away.
Children's deaths from smallpox fell, I think I got the statistic from you, Pat, and one of the, was it Brittany, fell from 25,000 deaths in a year to 1,000 deaths. Now that's a lot of innocent little children saved from a miserable death. And it's no surprise that in the face of this evidence, the resistance quietly backed away. But little was said. But this pattern has more repetitions. Back to your deal.
Yeah, so the next one had to do with anesthesia. The discovery of anesthesia was extremely important. Hitherto, people had relied if they had to do an amputation, for example, or if a woman was having terrible difficulty during childbirth, either you just put up with it or, you drank scotch. And so the discovery of chloroform and ether was extremely important. Again, the church opposed it. And this time the biblical reference was that, after all, Eve had tempted Adam, and God had said, as he threw them out of the Garden of Eden, henceforth shall you bring forth children in pain. So there were bitter disputes in Scotland and England particularly over whether women in childbirth, including women undergoing cesarean sections, whether they should be allowed to have anesthesia. Now, that was changed, really, by Queen Victoria, who was not about to put up with a lot of nonsense, and who had many children and did not want to have a lot of pain, and said, right-o, we're going to do this my way. And henceforth, again, the opposition of the church withered away quietly. Finally, my last case, 1956, Pope Pius XII has an injunction against anyone doing organ donation.
Organ transplant.
Or no organs shall be donated, especially from a living person, to another living person. Now, I think it's very interesting, and I think it's actually sort of morally scandalous that having now ceased to oppose it, the church has not bothered to come out and say, we have changed our minds on smallpox, on anesthesia, on dissection, on organ transplant. And my own view is that a similar thing is likely to happen with regard to especially very early abortions. The benefits are overwhelming, and the opposition will eventually wither away. The Catholic Church, after all, has only had a prohibition on abortion since 1870. Before that, it was considered as, moderately unacceptable, but, it was certainly not considered to be murder. So I think understanding the history is extremely important. I have to tell you, however, that although some people on the President's Bioethics Council found the history interesting, by and large they were offended. And they found my presentation of the data, and this is just the history. I didn't make it up. They found it to be something that made them extremely uncomfortable, and I was very disappointed.